Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another video. So today I'm going to be doing a video on discovery writing and talking about the reasons why I discovery write. So if you're not familiar with these terms, discovery writing, or pantsing as it's often called, I call it discovery writing because pantsing just sounds so weird, is writing without an outline, and plotting or outlining is obviously writing with an outline. For some reason, this is a contentious topic in the writing community. Even though it shouldn't be. It's just, do you use an outline or not? So this is not meant to be a video telling you that you should discovery write, because ultimately, you do you. Both methods are great. I've done both. They're both challenging. They both take skill. But for some reason, there is elitism about outlining where people be like, you should outline, and if you don't, it's because you're lazy, or your work will be bad. And anyways, for some reason there's a lot of negativity around discovery writing, which is just dumb. Like, it doesn't matter. So in today's video, I just wanted to talk about the benefits that I have personally found from discovery writing, because I feel like a lot of conversations around outlining versus discovery writing revolve around basically all the pros of outlining, and then the pros of discovery writing are like, well, you like it, but like it will turn out bad. I don't know, I think there's this misconception that discovery writers don't outline their books because they don't want to, or because that method doesn't work for them, but they have to just accept that the work will be inherently worse, you know? Like, I just feel like there's this idea that a book that's discovery written is going to be worse, and if you want to discovery write, you have to accept that, and you have to accept that the book will take more editing, and that is not true. There are actually a lot of benefits to discovery writing, and I'm not saying there aren't benefits to outlining. Outlining is great. Like, I am in awe of people who can outline their work. I am in awe of your ability to plan and see the future and be so organized and see your story from a global perspective. But I'm also impressed by me and the skills that I have, which are discovery writing. So neither is better, neither is worse, neither takes more skill, neither is for beginners, neither is more advanced, neither will lead to a better draft. I always say this, but the better method is, the one that's better for you. And if outlining doesn't really work for you, it won't lead to better drafts because you're trying to write in a way that's not natural. It's the same with discovery writing. If discovery writing doesn't work for you and you try to discovery write, your draft might be a disaster because you're someone who's better outlining. I just wanted to have a discussion about 10 benefits that I've found from discovery writing. So as a little bit of history, when I first started writing novels when I was 13, I discovery wrote, and I discovery wrote my first 3.5 novels, I guess. And then I started outlining. So I outlined one novel, I outlined the second half of another novel and finished it. Did I outline 5 novels? I guess I outlined 5 novels. And then I switched back to discovery writing. And I do have a video from when I just switched back to discovery writing. It's not like when you pick one, you're married to that. You can switch between the two. You can find a middle point. I guess I'm probably what many people would call a plantser, because I do a bit of loose outlining, like at times. I'll plan the next few chapters if I see how they're gonna go. Sometimes I'll write out a loose plot summary if I think it's gonna be beneficial to me, but for the most part, I do prefer to just explore the story, and that's how I find I do my best writing. The thing about discovery writing, it's not just that I enjoy it more. For me, it leads to actually better writing. So it's not just something that I do because it's fun, but I have to accept that the writing's going to be worse. The writing is genuinely better when I discovery write. Just do what works for you in the moment. I will make a couple outlining tools when I feel like they would benefit me, but for the most part, I discovery write. I don't know, I guess I just see too many discovery writers feeling dejected where they're like, yeah, I discovery write because I just can't write from an outline, but I have to accept that my book is going to be so hard to edit and it's going to be such a mess and it would be so much better if I outlined. No! Your book wouldn't necessarily be better if you outlined. Great books can be discovery written, and I think the funny thing about this elitism, which I've talked about in past videos, people are speaking for themselves, right? Like, they're like, oh, well, when I outline, the work is better, which is great. That means that you should outline your work. But you don't have access to the writing process of every book you've ever read. I bet you've read tons of books that were discovery written and you loved them, but you weren't judging the process because you didn't know the process. But when you don't know someone's writing process, you just judge the work, and I bet a lot of the work that you think is great was written with a process that maybe otherwise you might, I don't know what the word is, shame. And you here is outlining elitists, not a specific person, and probably not you watching this, because probably if you're watching this, you wanted to watch this video because you're like, discovery writing! I recently finished discovery writing a second novel after I came back to discovery writing. I feel like I've now had enough time to observe a ton of benefits because I've discovery written 2 novels over the past 3 years, and I've noticed a lot of things. So the first thing that I find so helpful with discovery writing is that the story will self-diagnose itself when there are problems. So one issue that I had when I was outlining, and I'm sure that I'm a better outliner, like someone who's naturally more inclined to outline their work, has ways to bypass this, but for me, as someone who's not really a natural outliner, this was a big problem for me. I would make my outline, and obviously the outline was made very zoomed out, which I struggle with. I'm a more like particular thinker, think of things in very small bits and small details, but I'm not very good at seeing my stories like from the giant scope. It's why I struggle to write like large scale plots. I tried to write a fantasy series once that had 6 point of view characters, and it actually crushed me alive. And it's for this reason I was constantly trying to see the story zoomed out, and I don't really see stories that way. I see them as little particular moments. And so it was really hard for me to outline. And so anyways, I would make this outline. I would get to a point in the story where something was fundamentally wrong with the story. Maybe the stakes were low, maybe there wasn't enough conflict, maybe the characters' motivations didn't fit what they were doing. I don't know, something was just off. It was misaligned. And when I was outlining, because the events were laid out for me, I could kind of just paint by numbers, right? Like I could just keep writing and muscle the story forward. I could just write scene by scene by scene, even if the scenes themselves weren't working in a larger story. So it was very hard to notice when things were fundamentally wrong, but I find as a discovery writer, it's pretty easy to know when something is off in your story because the story self-diagnoses itself, because what happens is you'll be writing, having a good time, and then suddenly it will all come to a grinding halt. You'll hit a wall, suddenly it will be hard. It's really easy for me to know when something is wrong with the story because suddenly it's hard to write. And usually if it's easy to write, all the pieces that make a story work are in place, and so the story just writes itself. But when something's not in place and something is wrong, it doesn't work. And so I find it's way easier to pinpoint the problem areas and when something's not working as a discovery writer and notice that while I'm drafting, because my writing process itself and how hard the book is to write will show me these issues, right? If it's hard to write, something's probably wrong. It's so hard to muscle forward a story that's not working as a discovery writer without stopping to fix the issue, whereas as an outliner, I found that I wouldn't necessarily notice these things because I could just keep painting by numbers. Next up is that I find my character work is a lot better. An issue that I would often have with my outlined work was characters doing things and the motivation. What was it? I think outlining is better for people whose stories stay a bit more static. They get an idea, they develop a story, and then they write that story, and the story is pretty much how they envisioned it. I think that those people are able to outline more successfully because they plan it out and then they write what they wanted to do. But I'm not that kind of person. My stories and my novels are like constantly ever shifting amorphous things. And so what would happen is I would start writing a book that I had outlined, and as I wrote, the characters would change from how I initially knew them because through the process of writing them, they inevitably change. But have you ever heard that every single time you play through a memory in your mind changes it just a tiny bit from the original memory? So literally every time you play through a memory, you're actually changing it a tiny bit, and it's getting a little further incrementally from the original memory. That's kind of what my character writing is like. Every single time I write a scene with a character, I feel like there's an incremental change in that character. I learn about my stories and my characters through writing them. I call it observant writing. I write things and then I observe it and then I understand it. I don't understand it and then I write it. And so for me, what would happen is I would get to a certain point in the book, and what the motivation that I originally thought the character would have in this scene, they did not have anymore because they'd changed enough that it didn't really make sense. And so there was just this constant misalignment between the events and who the characters were, because I'd planned out the story based on an understanding of the character that was no longer accurate. I felt like I was kind of putting them into place and making them do things even if they wouldn't necessarily do those things. Whereas now as a discovery writer, I find that the plot moves based on what the characters want. And I'm able to keep the plot moving based on who the character genuinely is at that moment in time, not who I thought they were going to be when I made the outline, because those things are usually not the same. The third benefit I find of discovery writing is that I have more information when I reach each plot point. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, like how do you have more information if you're discovery writing so you don't know anything? I'm the kind of person who I figure out my stories and I understand them through the process of writing them. Thinking about it beforehand, cool. but it's really only actually through writing it that I can really understand it, you know? So let's say I'm outlining a book and I decide what's going to happen in chapter 4. But as an outliner, I haven't actually written chapters 1 through 3 yet. I'm actually missing a lot of information about the story, because I haven't actually written that. But let's say I'm discovery writing, I write the first 3 chapters and then I get to chapter 4 and I can decide in that moment what's going to happen in chapter 4. I have a way more complex understanding of what comes beforehand because I've actually written it. So I have so much more information on those first 3 chapters. And I know that a lot of the time outliners, like one of the benefits of outlining is you know where your story is going. But for me, it's more important for me to know where my story was, right? Like what happens next is based on what came before. I can always keep figuring out what happens next. I can keep uncovering that, but what happened before is more important, I think, for creating like a cohesive plot line for me. Number 4 is that it's easier to make edits while I'm drafting because I don't have an outline to disrupt. As an outliner, I found it a lot harder to make those kinds of changes on the fly. Like you get to a certain point and you have an idea. The reason I found it a lot harder is because suddenly I was like, this is gonna ripple affect the rest of my outline and basically disrupt everything I had planned. But as a discovery writer, if you get to that point, you're like, you don't have an outline ahead of you that's now shattered in pieces. And so I found that, and this is just a mental thing, right? Like I think good outliners know how to go with the flow, and when they get to a point and they're like, oh wait, I have a new idea and it's better than what I had planned, they're able to adjust course. And you know, an outline is not the law. You can obviously always change what's in your outline, but for me mentally it was just a lot harder to think about making that change when I had something ahead that was now going to be disrupted, and it felt so much harder to fit all the pieces together. But as a discovery writer, if I get to a point and I'm like, this needs to happen, it's pretty easy to adjust course because I may have planned what's up ahead, but in much more loosely. Number 5 for me is much richer scene writing. Earlier I referred to myself as an observant writer, and I don't know what the opposite of an observant writer would be, but I think it would be someone who writes based on their understanding. My understanding is based on what I write. But I don't know, it's just how I am, right? Like, I don't think of global ideas and then work down to little ideas. I think of little ideas and then the big ideas come from those little ideas. I don't know why my brain works like that, but it's just how my brain works. As a discovery writer, the process of writing the scene is actually so important for my understanding of the story. I find that as a discovery writer, as I'm writing a scene, it feels like the difference between experiencing and remembering. Like as a discovery writer, I feel like I'm experiencing the scene and I'm there and I can touch every little thing in the world and I can see all the little nuances. But as an outliner, I always felt like I was remembering. It was more distant, it was more vague. I had to struggle to think of the little details and remember them. Whereas when I'm discovery writing, I kind of feel like I'm walking through the scene. So I find my scene work is so much richer. Like when I was outlining, one issue I often found was my scenes were just thin. They were underwritten, they were underdescribed. I would just have skeletal dialogue with no narrative for like pages. And the scenes were short, everything was underwritten. Like I was an underwriter, and I don't really underwrite anymore, but I don't really consider myself much of an overwriter either. Like as an outliner, I was quite the underwriter. I would have to go add an extra 30% pretty much almost every time. I find now my books are clocking in exactly where I want them to be. Like as an outliner, I was always rushing through the scenes, just not experiencing them very richly, and so they didn't turn out rich on the page. But as a discovery writer, I find I get such richer scene work. I feel like I didn't really understand how to write a scene and get a lot out of a scene and make a scene serve multiple purposes until I started discovery writing again. Because as an outliner, it was too easy for me to be like, this is the purpose of the scene as it says in my outline, now that's done, moving on, and the scenes just felt thin. However, a really interesting thing about that is that as an outliner, I actually had way more extraneous content in my work. Now, I think you're always gonna have some extraneous content, but I think it's something I often hear said by outliners. That is like, oh, well, when people discovery write, they end up with a lot of, redundant content that they have to cut. That happened to me way more when I was outlining, because when I was outlining, I would have a lot of scenes that actually didn't contribute to the story, but I thought they did at the time that I was making the outline. Whereas as a discovery writer, I find I just take it step by step based on what feels necessitated by the story. So I get to the next scene and I'm like, what needs to happen now? And so I don't find I deal with as much extraneous content. Sure, a little bit. I cut several chapters from my novel, but it was, first of all, way easier to pinpoint what the extraneous content was. As an outliner, I would have so much extraneous content, but my scenes were underwritten. It's like I was writing weak scenes that didn't accomplish anything, but there were too many of them. So overall bad writing. Whereas I find as a discovery writer, and also I'm just a better writer now, which is part of it. I've had more years to improve the craft and practice. I find my scenes do a lot more work and I don't have as many redundant ones. The next thing I find is that I have a much higher level of confidence. I made a whole video about my journey with writing and confidence, so if you're interested in that, I'll leave a link to that video. But my confidence is so much higher now that I am discovery writing. Partly it's because I'm much gentler with myself regarding the ups and downs of my writing process. Well, as an outliner, the book was laid out in front of me, right? Like, I knew every single scene that I had to write, and so it was really easy to kind of punish myself for not making progress because I felt like the progress should be easy. You know, it was like, you have every scene planned out, so you should be able to just sit down and write it, right? And as an outliner, I would write with these ridiculously high word count goals, and I would write books super fast. I did write faster as an outliner, so there's one thing, but I don't miss it because it was actually terrible. I was just exhausting myself to write bad books. I was not forgiving with myself if something wasn't working, because it was like the scene is there in front of you. You know exactly what you need to write. Why can't you write it? I felt like I was just always running to write the next scene, and because all the scenes were planned out, I'd be like, oh, well, why not write another? Why not write another in one day? But they would all be so thin, and I was just always rushing it, but I was also burning myself out. I would get burned out pretty much every time I finished a novel. I would just rush to write a novel as fast as I could, and then feel completely exhausted and burned out. Now as a discovery writer, I'm so much gentler with myself and the process. Like, if something's not working, I don't get mad about it. I don't feel like there's this expectation that I should be writing faster. I approach the story in a more personal way, and rather than, like I said earlier, painting by numbers and just rushing through it, it's much more enjoyable, and my confidence is a lot higher because I'm not constantly annoyed with myself for being unable to produce. Number 7 is that I find it way easier to know where to place information in the story. One thing I always struggled with when I was outlining, and this is honestly like one of the hardest parts of writing, is where do you put information? You know, like I have information, where does it go? And I felt like I was always putting information in the wrong place or conveying it really awkwardly, info dumps, as one might say. Whereas as a discovery writer, I find it so much easier because as you're writing, you get to a point in the story or the scene where you're like, that information just has to go here. I find as a discovery writer, the structure of the story will tell me where information needs to go. I get to a point, I'm like, oh, this information has to go here. It's the natural point for it. I even find it hard to go back and find places to add information when I'm editing because it's like, oh, where does this go? But as I'm actually writing the draft, I feel like the draft just tells me where information needs to go, and it feels so much more natural. Number 8 is that I just find the process more immersive, more intuitive, and more tactile. I like to enjoy writing. I don't write to write as fast as I can or produce as much as I can, and it's okay if that is how you write. Some people don't enjoy the drafting process as much. They love planning or they love editing. I love drafting. And so I want drafting to be fun. I kind of, with discovery writing, I'm like feeling my way through the story rather than just checking off points off a list. And so I just find it so much more immersive. I'm more checked into my intuition, and I'm an intuitive person. I think that's more how I feel my way through life and the world and writing itself. And so having a more intuitive writing process that is just based on what feels needed at any given moment is way more natural for me. And like I said earlier, it's just way more immersive. Yeah, outlining felt like I was painting by numbers, basically, just filling in the story, but half checked out at any given moment. Not really that engaged. But there was always that impulse to approach it in a very data-driven way. Writing down how many words I wrote every day, making schedules, making plans, setting word count goals, and that wasn't for me. It's just not how I work. I'm not super into data, and if you are, again, I love that for you. I kind of wish I could be more like that a lot of the time, but it's just not what I'm like. Like I said, I'm way more artistic than I am logical. I'm not really good with numbers. If I see math, I want to pass out. And so that was just an unnatural kind of box for me to try to force my writing process into. Now, my writing process, rather than being results-oriented, it's more process-oriented. I write because I want to learn about the story. I write because I have questions about the story that I want to figure out the answers to. I feel like my curiosity is what's spurring me forward rather than the goal to write a certain number of words. And number 10 is that I write the way that I live, which is just one moment at a time. In real life, there is no outline. You're just living moment to moment to moment to moment. You don't know what's going to come next. I think that discovery writing replicates that more closely, and so I find it more immersive. I feel like I'm participating in the story rather than observing it. As an outliner, I always felt like an observer of the story. I felt distanced from it. There was always this pane of glass between me and the story. As a discovery writer, I really feel like I am in the story. It's way more immersive. It's more tactile, and the writing process replicates life more closely, just one step at a time. For me, the results don't lie. I write much better work when I discovery write. Part of the reason I started discovery writing is because I was trying to write novels from outlines because that's what I've been doing for years. Outlining was great for me, and I did learn a lot about writing from the time that I spent outlining my work. And if you don't know which process will work for you, I definitely recommend just trying them both. Sometimes it's hard to know which will work for you. Now that I've just finished a second novel with my new writing process, I feel really comfortable with this writing process. I've never enjoyed writing more than with these past 2 novels that I've written. I think the most important thing is writing in a way that you find fun. When I see people being elitist about outlining, what they'll say to discovery writers is, I know you hate outlining and it's not fun for you, but this isn't about having fun. Writing is art. If you didn't enjoy doing it, you could make so much more money doing pretty much anything else on this earth. And I personally think that you will do your best writing when you enjoy it. For some people, having an outline makes them feel confident and secure and organized, and that's fun for them. For other people, discovery writing, allows them to feel more curious and imaginative, and that's what's fun for them. I think that's the most important thing. If you're trying to figure out which one is right for you, which one do you have more fun doing? That will probably lead to the best results in the end. So that's my little chat on discovery writing for the day, and the benefits that I have found as a discovery writer. I would love to hear which method you use and why you like it. And if you are interested in some discovery writing tips, I do have an older video that I made on a bunch of tips for discovery writers, so I will leave a link to that in the cards and in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!